There's nobody to plant and harvest food, to go hunting, to go fishing, to do all the normal things through which a community feeds itself. So from all of these causes, starvation, being worked to death, and most of all from the disease that hit this famine-ridden population, the best estimates are that between 1880, when King Leopold first got his hands on the Congo, and 1920, that in that 40-year period, the population was slashed from about 20 million at the beginning of that period to around 10 million at the end. So an enormous loss of human life.
Huge building projects throughout Belgium were funded by Leopold's wealth to celebrate his reign. Leopold built himself a palace, now called the Museum of Central Africa, to display his spoils. For historian Bambi Koipins, whose father is Congolese, the building embodies the myths created to justify Belgian rule in the Congo.
The central hall gives you the idea of what the museum is supposed to be about. You have the central dome through which the light falls on the heart of darkness underneath, you can say. Simultaneously, the dome also presents the sky, God, and then in the central hall, underneath that representation of Leopold II, are statues of Congolese. So what you really see were the hierarchical relationships that structured the relations between the colonized and the colonizers. As a human being, I'm obviously shocked by that, because it is very clear that Africans, the way that this museum was originally set up and the way that most of the exhibitions still work, are really dehumanized because they were seen and represented as savages who really needed the help of outsiders, i.e. Europeans, to transform them into fully civilized human beings.
From the late 19th century onwards, human zoos exhibiting Africans in their primitive state became popular around Europe. One of the first was housed in the grounds of Leopold's museum.
The Africans were put on display so people could go and see them in very much the same way that they could look at, say, caged animals in a zoo, and their reactions were also very similar. There were notices saying that people were not allowed to throw peanuts at the Africans because that was what they did. This museum is also, in a very real sense, the only monument to Belgian colonial history left in this country. So if we dismantle the museum, there is a very great danger that we also eradicate the public memory of that colonial heritage. And once that happens, of course, one paves the way for all these people who say, well, it was not as bad as that, was it? And Leopold II really did do a great deal of good.
In 1908, the year before Leopold died, his crimes were made public and he was forced to hand control of the Congo over to the Belgian government. But the cruelty continued.
The forced labor system did not come to an end because it was so profitable. The new Belgian Congo continued it more or less until the early 1920s. At that point, the Belgian colonial officials realized that their population was shrinking so rapidly from the effects of the forced labor system that they had to modify it. They had to make it less lethal, or otherwise they would have no labor force left.
Although 10 million people died, the Congolese genocide has largely been forgotten in Europe. In the book The Heart of Darkness, the author Joseph Conrad, who witnessed the violence in the Congo, writes, "The conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much." It was only at the end of the Second World War, when newsreels documented the Nazis' extermination of 6 million Jews, that the words genocide, Holocaust, and even racism passed into common usage.
Whatever the origins of the word racism, that is when it was first coined, there's no doubt that it was first used to think about Nazi treatment of Jewish people. That was the case that gave the word racism its modern shape and meaning, in fact, brought it into use as a word, and also, therefore, brought it into use in a context where it was unequivocally clear that it was a very bad thing.
Even so, brutal treatment of non-white, non-Europeans was tolerated by the Western nations. When the National Party came to power in South Africa in 1948, they passed a series of laws that institutionalized white supremacy. Yet apartheid attracted little criticism from the West.
What white people wanted in this country was to protect their political supremacy, but in ways that nevertheless guaranteed them access to as much black labor as they wanted. One should remember that apartheid was never a racially exterminationist regime. The intention was never to get rid of black people. The intention was to deploy black people in ways that made good economic sense to white people, so that the advantages of apartheid to whites would be a combination of political supremacy and economic prosperity. So the purpose of racial classification was to provide a mechanism for segregating access to resources, segregating access to power. So your racial classification, once determined, affected where you lived. It determined where you worked and what sort of work you were entitled to do. It determined who you had sex with and who you could marry. It determined what schools your children went to and what universities they were entitled to go to. It determined what shops you were allowed to use, whether you were allowed to drink certain kinds of alcohol and where, whether you were entitled to go to cinemas. In other words, it was a categorization that affected your life across the board, and it became internalized as in a very intimate way as the basis of how people thought of themselves.
Do you think that the South African government's racial policy is right?
I really do, because we cannot mix with the lower nations at the moment, unless they are cultivated and educated and so on.
Apartheid erected a vast edifice of racist legislation, making interracial relationships illegal and forcing individuals to be racially categorized. Amid rising international criticism of their policies, the architects of apartheid emulated the creators of Jim Crow and adopted the separate but equal rhetoric of segregation.
The South African government just changed its rhetoric. And it began saying not that blacks were inferior creatures, but rather that everybody could govern themselves in their own particular places and ways. So it set up these 10 so-called homelands, or Bantustans as they were once called, where close to a majority of the population of South Africa was crammed onto these desolate stretches of land that never amounted to more than a tiny percentage of the country's land area. And they were dressed up with prime ministers and cabinets and flags and so forth, but it was a sham. But they had to go through the sham because things in the world had changed, and if they had been doing this in the early 19th century, they wouldn't have bothered about any of the sham.
During the 1950s, the anti-apartheid movement gained momentum. In 1960, 300 people demonstrated against the pass laws in a town called Sharpeville in the Transvaal, using the tactics of non-violent passive resistance developed over the years.
In South Africa, you'd had a history of very peaceful, humble, polite petitioning of the authorities, deputations, and each deputation, came back empty-handed. And well, if that doesn't work, let's try something else. So people then adopted non-violent forms of resistance. But that was just met with violence, culminating in Sharpeville.